Yeah, we are live now.
Okay.
Let me start the introduction. Yeah. Good day to all. A warm welcome to each and everyone present for Saveetha International Architecture Talk Series conducted by Saveetha College of Architecture and Design, Saveetha Institute of Medical and Technical Sciences. I am Dr. Deepak Arun, Associate Dean International Affairs, Saveetha School of Engineering, Saveetha Institute of Medical and Technical Sciences. Today, many are watching the event even through our SIMATS Facebook page. This is the third talk in the series. At the outset, I extend my special thanks to our Honorable Chancellor, sir. I also extend my sincere thanks to our Director, Madam, for Madam's continuous support, guidance, and motivation to conduct this event in a successful manner. Today we have with us Professor Robert Brown from University of Plymouth, UK, Saveetha Institute of Medical and Technical Sciences, and University of Plymouth, UK have signed a memorandum of understanding long back, and there are a lot of ongoing collaboration in various fields of science and technology. Today, it is another milestone in our relationship with respect to architecture. Now I invite Dean, Saveetha College of Architecture and Design, Professor Balsava, to give his welcome address. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Deepak. We are really honored to have Professor Robert Brown with us today in the Saveetha Architecture International talk series. The talk is titled From Conceptual Orientation to a Praxis of Making. Thank you, Professor Brown, for being with us today and sharing with a large audience right from India to Europe and Southeast Asia have logged in today. So we look forward to your presentation. And at the end of the presentation, we would have a small interactive session because even those who are with us in the room and those who are texting us would be raising some thoughts, questions, and I would look forward to an interaction where you respond to some of them, and more in the context of a more long-term kind of an exchange that hopefully grows from this presentation. I found in the earlier discussions, we have a lot of synergy in terms of a basic orientation to architectural education as well as practice. And I think that can evolve a lot of synergy. We look forward to your talk, and I'm sure at the end of it, we'll have a very interactive session with you. Thank you, Professor. I would request architect Sandhya to briefly introduce you, and then maybe we could commence the talk. Architect Sandhya, would you please introduce Professor Brown?
Yes, sure, sir. Am I audible, sir?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. So myself, Assistant Professor Sandhya here from SCAD, wishing a warm good evening to one and all present here. So I'm here to introduce Professor Robert Brown, an ardent researcher and a private practitioner who has completed his Bachelor of Science in Architectural Studies and also his Master of Architecture from the University of Illinois. He has also completed the course on National Certificate in Tenant Participation, Institute of Housing. Currently, the program leader of the Master of Architecture at the School of Art, Design and Architecture at the Plymouth University. So from 1997 to the present day, Professor Robert Brown has worked with many universities in UK and has also collaborated with various firms inside as well as outside UK. He is also successfully running his own private practice and consultant work. He is also an active member of the Royal Institute of British Architects. He is also a member of the Charge Editorial Board and Architectural Humanities Research Association Steering Committee. With more than 30 research publications to his credit, his research interests include socio-cultural identity in relation to place, urbanism, and architectural pedagogy. We are pleased to have you here, sir. On to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Are we ready to go then?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Okay, right. just want to quickly note the title. You should be able to see something that says from conceptual orientation to a praxis of making, but in parentheses it says in a context of change. That will all become clear. But to begin with, I want to give my thanks to everyone there for this very kind invitation to speak. Very honored to do so, and very excited, and really appreciate in particular Dr. Deepak and Professor Balsavar's invitation, and also their prompt. I had a discussion with them on Monday about this talk, and that actually proved very useful. It ended up prompting me to think a little bit more about what I was going to be speaking on. And it has contributed to the nature of what I'm going to say right now. So again, thank you. And thank you to everyone who is in attendance today. I just want to go back and reintroduce myself. I appreciate the introduction, but there's something a message at the end of this that's important. So I am going to take a step backwards. As has been noted, I'm the MArch program leader at the University of Plymouth in the UK, studied University of Illinois, and as you can guess from my accent, I am not English. I'm from the States originally, the state of Illinois. When I graduated, I moved to Chicago and worked for a fairly well-known architect in the States, Stanley Tigerman, doing a lot of housing for very wealthy people, interestingly. And after several years of that, opportunity arose, and I moved to London, where I worked for about the next 12 or so years in community development. And some of that practice saw me go to Kenya, Malawi, South Africa, but also significantly, perhaps for you, also spent some time in India. And I was on secondment to the Maharashtra Housing and Area Development Authority in Pune. And while I was there, I was also doing some work for some local architects, again, centered around community development. So all in all, I've had the very fortunate opportunity to practice in 9 different countries over the years. I've also been involved in education in various ways in 14 different countries, whether through teaching, whether through external examining, or sitting on the Royal Institute of British Architects validation board. So a lot of moving around. And on a personal note, as you can tell, I'm from the US. My wife is Japanese, and our 2 children have been born in the UK. So if anything, what I have found in my life is it's about change. It's been not necessarily constant change, but a process of change, a number of shifts that I've been going through over the course of my life, adjusting to new conditions, but also being very proactive about that change as well. So that leads me into saying it is a changing world. And the original title of the talk, as Professor Balsavar set out, was From Conceptual Orientation to a Praxis of Making. But I decided after the discussion with him and Dr. Deepak on Monday that I would add in a context of change. And that will become very important in the course of the talk. So again, we live in a changing world. The pandemic that is still ongoing has really hammered that home quite clearly for us. Issues of climate chaos or climate change are yet another manifestation of how the world around us is changing, but also, I think, significantly economic and political shifts that have taken place. The center of the world, if it ever was, is no longer Western Europe or the United States. The focus of economic activity has really shifted to Southeast Asia. And as an example of that, one only need to look at what's happened in India over the past 25 years. When I was working for MATA in India, that was back in 1996. And I spent time both in Pune, but also in Mumbai. I had opportunity to go back to Mumbai about 20 years later, and I was completely overwhelmed by the amount of change that had taken place. And that's just a reflection of the dynamic that's present in India, the energies there, and India, China, and other countries in Southeast Asia really emerging as leaders in the world. So again, the world is just full of change, and that's very much the nature of it. And if you haven't spotted me in this image, that's me on the far right-hand side. Believe it or not, the guy with the hair. Just another example of change going on in the world. I used to have hair once upon a time. That's long since gone. I've talked about change in a very global sense, and maybe some allusions to urban, in terms of increasing urban world, long since past the point where it's over 50% of the world living in urban areas. But I don't want to talk really about the global or urban scale. I want to talk about change at the scale of the building, and to think about change in terms of how we design and make buildings. And in talking about this, I'm going to challenge some received architectural principles, and I want to put forward an alternative, but that's an alternative that I will say is non-oppositional. I'm not trying to tear down those principles, but rather I'm trying to place something alongside. To begin with, I want to talk about the idea of orientation, or I can also use the word sensibility. And by sensibility, I'm referring to a heightened sensitivity we have towards a set of beliefs, ideas, or practices. A reflection of this is this image, Picasso's Bull's Head. And I've always been fascinated by this piece of work. It looks so much like a bull's head, but I love the fact that it's simply the seat and handlebars of an old rusty bike that have been repositioned. That idea of taking one thing and turning it into something else. And it opens up new ways of thinking. And on this idea of sensibilities that we have, that we are sensitive to certain things that we value, that we have almost through our own practices become conditioned to respond to. That's part of a worldview we have, a way of looking at the world. And it starts to engender patterns about how we engage with things, what we choose to look at, and how we choose to look at it. So that sensibility informs how we orient ourselves towards the world. This is just an underlying concept for me about how I'm thinking about things in terms of how I approach architecture, how I approach teaching, but it's also an attitude we try and instill in our students. Excuse me. To think then about certain sensibilities that I have, one aspect of it is this proposition that architecture represents architecture. And this is a thought that's taken from Karsten Harries in his book, The Ethical Function of Architecture, where he notes works of architecture represent buildings. Representation makes visible. It's a representation of what they are. So it's not just a building in itself, but rather it represents it to us to make us think about it, to see it again. Even if we're familiar with it, it still forces us or challenges us to consider what it means. And this is something that I find valuable, whether as a designer or as an educator, thinking about the act of designing a building, act of designing a doorway, whatever it may be, how it's challenging us to rethink what that thing is and our relationship to it. One aspect then of this representation is that architecture represents its making. And there's a quote here from Viollet-le-Duc, who notes all architecture proceeds from structure. And the first condition at which it should aim is to make the outward form accord with that structure. Well, I'm using the word structure here in a very broadened sense. I'm talking about the idea of how something's made. And I've always liked this image of Frank Lloyd Wright's Morris gift shop in San Francisco, and the way that the very thin Roman type bricks are used in the arch to accentuate both the opening, but also to accentuate how that thing is made. It draws attention to the very act of how those bricks were laid to form that arch. And in talking about making, I want to make reference to the word tectonics. This is a word that's used oftentimes in architectural education, maybe not so much in practice. It has its origins in the Greek word tektonikos, which comes from tekton, meaning carpenter or builder. And obviously that's led to our present day word, architecture or architect. But tectonics is about relating to building or construction. There's a reason why I'm drawing attention to this word, but I just want to plant the seed just for the moment, the idea of thinking about how something is built or made. And that is literally one of the keystones of the word architect. So continuing on with this thought about tectonics relating to construction, but particularly here, this definition about assembly, of making with parts, of making a space by bringing together a number of smaller pieces and thinking about how each piece is connected to the next. And that we understand tectonics and understand architecture as a study of those connections and the physical relationships between different elements. So these are some fundamental principles that I'm drawing upon that reflect a certain sensibility that I have, but are shared by a number of other architects. I think it's very evident in Stephen Hull's house here at Martha's Vineyard, him celebrating the craft of putting the timber together. Martin Heidegger has talked about tectonics, and he makes particular reference to the word Techne. And what he's trying to draw attention to in his use of the word Techne is not just the act of bringing some stuff together, but there's a very important word in there, which is revealing. The idea in bringing something together, it's trying to reveal the very act of its making. Does the actual composition, construction tell you something about the nature of the material, how different materials are brought together? And Heidegger continues on, referenced here by Collins and Selina, talking about the idea of presence. So for Heidegger, it's not just about the activities and skills of the craft worker, but the intentions of the worker in making something. And recognizing it's not simply a pragmatic act of bringing things together, that is a practical connection of part A to part B, but rather that there's something poetic in that act. And that poetic act is meant to bring forth, to bring something into presence. And he goes on to note this word aletheia, of fundamental disclosure, to make present, to reveal, to allow us to see. And this is part of that act of representing architecture, making visible to us. The stairway here in Carlo Scarpa's Castelvecchio in Verona, Italy, very evocative about these bent pieces of steel and the way they come over to the existing brick wall, and a rather elaborate celebration of how that steel stair meets the wall, where the steel treads actually curve back up on the wall and provide a plane for fixing a bolt into the wall. There's simpler ways he could have done it, arguably more effective, perhaps even ones that are more structurally sound, because he's putting a lot of weight on each individual bolt as a person steps on the stair. It may have made more sense to embed the stair into that brick wall and rely upon compressive forces. as opposed to putting the steel bolt here in tension. But there's something that he's also really trying to do in this act of drawing your attention to those connections. There's something almost fragile or tenuous about the connection, which highlights the very act of walking up the stair then. Returning back to Carsten Harries, and he's very much influenced by Heidegger's thinking, he talks about, introduces the idea of something being timeless. And he makes a connection between beauty and something being timeless. Possibly here evoked by Mies van der Rohe's Farnsworth House. But some particular quality, almost essential, that seems to be without any sort of particular time, but actually is timeless, lasts forever. And Carsten Harries is finding beauty in the idea that this thing extends over time. And this is something that Juhani Pallasmaa picks up on. And he presents this rather interesting phrase of the idea that the drama of construction is silenced into matter, space, and light, sounding a bit like Louis Kahn here. And that ultimately architecture is the art of petrified silence. And he goes on to make reference to pyramids in Egypt, Gothic cathedrals, the Pantheon in Rome, as examples of that. These edifices that seem to be lasting forever. And to use his phrase, petrified. There are these fixed things, monumental, stable, fixed. And Pallasmaa continues on, saying that architecture detaches us from the presence and allows us to experience the slow, firm flow of time. So another way of saying this idea of timeless and the idea that things extend over time, and the use of the word slow and firm, something that's stable, something that we can count on, something that is gradual, arguably regular. And Lincoln Cathedral here in the UK illustrating that, the idea that this is something that was built over 500 years ago, but it stands still today pretty much as it was originally built. Having set this up, I want to momentarily critique that. I want to challenge what Carsten Harries has said, and I want to challenge what Juhani Pallasmaa has said. I will, in the end, get back to him, but bear with me for a moment. My critique is I'm wary in what they're saying that it, for me, renders a building unto itself. It has the potential, in the way they're discussing a building, to think of the building as something abstract, idealized, as resistant to time, and make reference to Plato's discussion of a chair. This is an image of Plato sitting in a chair. And he talks about the idea of a chair as this idealized thing existing in effect in abstract space. And the actual chairs that we make, that we sit on, are somehow compromised. They're trying to live up to that ideal, but they can't. But I want to talk here about real chairs, that is, real buildings. I don't want to talk about the ideal, abstracted, timeless entity. Rather, I want to talk about the here and now, the idea of something that's quite tangible in front of me, because I believe that's what architects work with. We don't have the luxury generally of working in an abstracted realm. We're working in a world that's full of challenges, that presents to us potential compromises. And part of the act of an architect is understanding how we respond to those challenges. And I think that's where the beauty comes out. One of the ways that change is talked about and embraced in discussions of architecture is about patina. And here Pallasma refers to the patina of wear, adding to an enriching experience of time. And it adds something in terms of bringing out the materials of construction. I think that's valuable. There's plenty of buildings that I've seen in the world that I value for the material qualities, for the nature of how a patina is developed, how that material changes over time. But I worry if the focus is solely on that, it becomes an aestheticization of that. It objectifies the building and it disregards the very subjective nature of the building and the life within it. And I would argue that when we talk about time in architecture and change, it has to be more than just a patina, and draw upon Stuart Brand's, I think, very excellent book, How Buildings Learn. And he puts forward the proposition, all buildings except monuments adapt anyway, however poorly, because the usages in and around them are constantly changing. And connected with this, I want to draw upon a philosopher, Mikhail Bakhtin, who I often refer to in my own work. And he puts forward this concept of unfinalizability. And he suggests that in order to live and act, I need to be unconsummated or unfinalized. I need to be open for myself. I cannot limit myself. I have to be open to the idea of change because the world is going to present me with change. If I try to remain fixed within that, it limits how I live and how I can act. I have to be open to the idea of change because that's what's occurring all around me. And I understand that that change is irregular. It has jumps. And Amitav Ghosh has written on this, quoting Moretti, the idea that narrative pressure is compatible with the new regularity of bourgeois life. Critiquing here the idea of I can live this very comfortable life, and I think that everything can be regular. I can get up at a certain time, I have my breakfast at a certain time, I go to work, I come home from work, I do certain things, thinking about it as if it's all under control. Well, if anybody in the room has children, they will quickly know any sort of sense of regularity quickly disappears from one's life. And just using my own children as an example, there's constantly things that present themselves in the course of the day. Suddenly, my youngest doesn't want to put on her shoes, and our whole schedule's thrown off. How do we manage? We have to deal with that. That's part of life. It is irregular. However much I might try to make it regular, it is irregular. And as Ghosh goes on to note, nature jumps. It doesn't move gradually. There's sudden changes. The pandemic is a reflection of that. The horrific tsunami that struck India and Sri Lanka and Malaysia and Indonesia a number of years ago, completely unexpected. It's a sudden jump. The world isn't part of gradual, regular change. It is full of all sorts of schisms, fractures, things that suddenly throw us off base. But those changes don't have to be so threatening. They can also become things that we can take command of. And returning now back to Pallasma, the idea that I can engage with architecture in a much more participatory way. I don't have to think of it as an abstracted, idealized edifice. It's something I can touch. It's something I can interact with. And as Pallasma notes, most enjoyable museum, office, or residential space is often one that's been fitted into a recycled building. There's an element of change present already in that discussion. So rather than things that are fixed, what I like here, Pallasma is talking about, is the idea that that architecture that we value can be open to change. And oftentimes it's that contrast between something existing, something new, that can actually be quite rich in terms of our experience of a place. And Plasma goes on to talk about the idea of fragility in architecture and how that fragile structure can project an open-endedness, and it brings with it its own aesthetic values. And I would also argue it brings something in terms of the participants being able to engage with that architecture to make that mark themselves. So understanding that the architecture doesn't need to be thought about as something fixed, rather we're thinking about it having a life. There's a life leading up to it being built, but then there's a continuing life in terms of what happens when that building is inhabited. So I've tried to set out an orientation that reflects something of my own interest and an aspect of what we're asking students to engage with at Plymouth. Underpinning our work in the studio is an agency of sociocultural, economic, and ecological engagement. And this is done through live projects in both the BA architecture and the M.Arch. We are engaging with things where there's fundamental questions we're asking students, not just about designing a building, but what role does that building play in improving people's lives, whether socioculturally, economically, and/or ecologically. This is an image of the Roland Novinsky building, the building which architecture sits in at the University of Plymouth. This is a shot of the interior. I'll be coming back to these shots in just a moment. But as part of that live project work, we're engaging with external partners, community-based organizations, schools, local government. We've done that both in Plymouth and have done that overseas. Up till last year, we'd spent the 3 preceding years with the M.Arch program working in Macau, China. We've worked in other parts of Europe. But wherever we're at, there's a fundamental to the way we work is this idea of collaboration. And that extends across the whole school. In the BA Architecture Year 1, it's about small-scale site interventions where the students are designing things, but then they're also actually building them on site. At the M.Arch, the scale's shifted up to much larger buildings and working at the urban scale. We're not building those for obvious reasons, but we do a lot of testing through what I would call maquettes. This comes from art or particular sculpture, and the sculptor building a small model of the sculpture they were going to build later, a way of testing out certain ideas. A thing I just want to quickly draw attention to, I've talked about the idea of something being fixed, timeless, which arguably is reflected in that image of the exterior of the building. But as you can see here, there's a interior, this atrium, in a very different feel. I'm just going to note, I'm getting a strange echo now. Are you hearing that?
Yeah, now it is okay. Earlier, before 2 sentences, we were hearing a couple of echoes, but now
right.
you are good to go, yeah.
Okay, that's fine. Suddenly there was a strange echo. Anyway, I just find it very strange. You make your own comment that our building seems to be doing one thing on the outside, and on the inside, it seems very much open to change. But maybe that's something to talk about later. I find that rather interesting in the context of this talk. So I want to talk about a few examples of some things that we've been doing at Plymouth that reflect this idea of engaging with making, and notably making that's based around thoughts of change. So the first example is actually taken from some work our BA Architecture Year 1 did on behalf of a local primary school here in Plymouth. And the architecture students engaged in some participatory exercises, both with children and staff from the school, but also with education students from the university. And their prompt was to design an outdoor learning space for the school, set up on the kind of the top of this hill that was overlooking the school. And underpinning the work, partly driven by the fact that the school didn't have money and we didn't really have money to spend on it, is that we were taking a lot of found timber or donated timber and recycling it. That should be seen. This is kind of the exterior wall looking up the hill. And what students got a hold of was about 100 timber pallets. And if you don't know what a timber pallet is, it's used in warehouses, docks, where there's a timber pallet, and then whatever is being transported is put on top of that. It keeps whatever is being transported off the ground from getting wet. And it also allows for a forklift to easily pick up whatever the item is without damaging it. It's just picking up the pallet and the material sitting on top of it. So the students got a hold of these timber pallets, dismantled them, took all the nails off or out, sanded all the pieces down, and started using them either in existing form and or in terms of a refabricated form to make this construction. So again, this is the view of it looking up the hill at this kind of protective wall that faced out towards the River Tamar that sits on one side of Plymouth, and a very, very windy site. So this protective wall is creating this enclosure to protect the children from what can be some very strong winds. And this is a view of the interior, and you can see the evidence of the timber pallets that have been formed to create this wall. But this is the opposite side, where it's not so much about enclosure, but creating these pockets where they can put things during the course of their lesson. And timber pallets are also used to create the bench or seating that wraps in this circular structure. And then this is a close-up, and there was a fire pit sitting in the center, creating something of a central focus point. You can see the more open side of the enclosure on the left-hand side with the seats. And in the background is the side that faces towards the river, which is the much more solid element. So there's something kind of fun about that play of solid and much more open, also just like the casting of the shadows on the ground. But that was all designed by our first-year students and working with the children and staff from that school. But fundamental to the way that they were designing it was thinking about, how are we going to make it? They didn't come up with a design, then go out and find some timber, and then think about how would they fabricate the timber to fit that design. Rather, fundamental to the way that they worked was thinking about the idea that they're going to take these materials, i.e. the timber pallet, recycle it, and make it into something new. So that was fundamental to their design process. It didn't come later on. It was there from the beginning as they were talking to the children and exploring different alternatives. In the end, they ended up choosing the timber pallets. But that idea of making and recycling was very much present as part of the whole of the design process. I'm going to jump now to the Master of Architecture program and show 3 schemes from that to further illustrate these ideas of making and accommodating change. And in this scheme, it's a bit more about reinvention and active enabling and future adaptation. So the scheme is allowing for that. And the scheme sits in Riga, the capital of Latvia, and we're working on this bit of land that was formerly the port of Riga, and the port had been moved further downstream to the Gulf of Riga. So there was an empty site left behind. We were working with the developer that owned the site to think about what nature of things that we could put in there. And in this particular scheme, the student had come up with this idea of a timber construction college and cultural center. In part, he was trying to give value to the presence of a number of timber buildings that were present in Riga already, dating back several hundred years. And that was partly the cultural aspect, and also recognizing that Latvians have a very strong connection with the landscape, which is about things like timber, about apples, other fruits and vegetables that come with it. But almost everybody in Latvia seems to have a farm if they don't already live on one. Even if they're living in the city, they have some sort of connection to a farm. So very strongly connected to landscape. And he wanted to celebrate that culture, notably here through the idea of timber. But also, timber construction skills had strangely started to fade out in Latvia. And so he wanted to create this college that would reintroduce construction skills to people in Latvia so they could get involved in both maintaining existing buildings, but thinking about, from a sustainability standpoint, how timber could be used more and more in more contemporary buildings. And this is an image moving closer in at a later stage. The first bit was about him. That first image was about him developing something at a more urban scale and a number of buildings sitting on the island, but then this kind of connecting piece that would go across the river to the other side of the city. But in this image, he's focused down now to the idea of the creation of this timber college. And his proposal was that the college would grow with each successive cohort. More and more space would be added. So they would start literally by making the first pod or building themselves, move into that. But then the next cohort would then use that existing pod as a base to start constructing the second one. And over the years, they would keep to it and they would move along in sequence. And some of the initial buildings would then be given over to other things, a craft shop for the making of furniture from timber, or somebody making kitchen utensils out of timber. So this thing would always be changing and growing. And there would be opportunities for those constructing to learn from things that have done in the past, but also to advance them. And they would be looking at what others had done before them, but thinking about how they might modify it in relation to particular needs of what they were working with at that time. And this is reflected in the students' work, going back to revisit traditional timber techniques, but reinventing those in a more contemporary way. And then this drawing at the bottom, you see a number of pods or small structures, and that's him reflecting this idea of how these things would be built, and a series of them adding up to a bigger whole, but there's always this additive growth that's happening. And in this drawing, those cubes of buildings are transformed, and he's showing you in the middle how it's constructed, but it goes up to a detail he was exploring. And that's an image of it, a maquette, or a small corner detail of his building where he's exploring how it would be fabricated. So we see on the right-hand side the kind of ghosted image of him constructing his little maquette, but then to the left of that are all the kit of parts that are laid out. And he was very meticulous in terms of his planning, thinking about, how do I make this as efficient as possible, and how do I make it as easy as possible for somebody to learn and quickly acquire a set of skills. They can then go on to embellish that or develop those skills later. But he was trying to think about how to make this as a very simple act of construction that would allow people to learn much easier. And then the final image of that, just some photographs of him actually constructing this maquette. So in the upper left-hand corner, again, the kit of parts that he was working with, and then he was going through that act of making. But what's really rich about this is that level of thought, the rigor present in him thinking about, how do I put this together? And not only how do I put it together, but how do I design it so it achieves a certain final result in the building, but also how could the actual act of making be an educational device? That is, somebody making this would learn how to build. So I like that this thing kind of turns in on itself in multiple ways, where it is reinventing traditional techniques, but at the same time it's helping people to learn, and it's opening up possibilities for the future. Another project from that same site, another student, working on a landscape research center. And the aspect of change he was interested in was about the landscape itself. The port area was, in effect, an island in the river. That was where we were working. And that island hadn't always been there. And with the disappearance of the port, he was valuing the idea that maybe that island could be returned back to the river. So his design was based on the idea of an armature or a kind of long device, almost like this holding frame that's reflected in the two model photographs at the bottom, upon which he would build his structure, but around it, the land would be allowed to become destabilized and eventually turn back into either a sandbar, which it once was, or a bit of marshland, which it also once was. He wanted to make the industrial site that had been present there as part of the port disappear and for nature to reclaim it back. So there's an act of subtraction that's present in the way he's affecting change. This is just an image of that armature or frame on which his building would sit, in a series of groins, these elements in black that are coming out from that structure. But I think more important is the way he was studying this in fairly conventional models. But a key thing for him was, how was he going to build this armature and building on the site that is, at the beginning, solid ground, but eventually will become not solid ground, i.e. marshland or shifting sandbar. And so a lot of his focus was not just on the building itself, but on its foundations. What sort of foundation could he have that would accommodate change, that would accommodate the idea that the ground itself was being subtracted away? And so this model was starting to tease out a little bit more about that, which is reflected in these drawings, a bit of a complicated overlay. But the key thing is actually in the lower right-hand corner of this drawing, and you can see what, in effect, is a screw. And his idea for the foundation was that there would be these giant metal screws that would be screwed into the ground. And as the landscape changed, these screws were quite far down. So even though the ground was becoming destabilized, his building was completely stable. But he was also anticipating change, and the way he designed the building was not so that it could just be easily constructed, but also that it could be easily deconstructed. So the timber construction, that's the main part of the building, was designed so that it could be dismantled, but also even the foundations could be unscrewed from the ground, taken out, and no trace of that building being left behind. It would completely turn back to being part of the river. The final scheme I want to show is one that a pair of students did a couple of years ago in Macau. And they were very concerned with the idea of how their building would fit into the existing fabric. It's a very dense city, arguably the most densely populated city on Earth. And so they thought about, at the urban scale, a series of interventions and connecting elements that layer into that fabric that start to connect their pieces together. And the drawings in the middle show kind of 3 points where they identified key interventions to be made. And then for their building, they actually selected one of these elements to focus on. But it was very much unlike the last one, which was about subtraction. This is very much about additive growth and anticipating future growth. So this is an image showing the building proposition for a market and cultural center in perspective at the bottom, a plan and section. And what they were doing was creating this framework, or again, an armature, which could be added to over time, that market stalls would start to populate it. The people owning those market stalls would start to affect change, adding further layers that fitted their stall, what they were selling, but also a cultural center. And the cultural center was seen as something that would constantly be evolving, reflecting the changing nature of Macau itself. As various immigrants and people from around the world move there and or visit there as tourists, they wanted to see their building as something that wasn't static, but constantly changing and reflecting the nature of the city as this place that's full of change. So creating, again, this armature to which various elements start to become added. And that's, again, reflected here in both the models at the bottom, a series of different tests, but also particularly in the perspective at the top, the nature of that armature, the structure really comes through. And then, again, series of interventions made by later people. What they're trying to do is anticipate change. How can the nature of that framework accommodate what comes after? Does it actually add something to it? But also, quite critically, they're also thinking about what's happening in Macau, and it's increasingly becoming densified. And because they have a limited amount of land, because they're on an island, the way that they densify further and further is by going up. So their armature was at a height of about 4 stories, but they're anticipating future growth. So everything had been oversized to allow for the construction of a tall building to be put on top of it. So the 4 stories that they have these very thick columns that anticipate that later growth. But they're also having to think about what that later growth might need in terms of vertical circulation and how that impacts their existing framework. And the way that they were doing this was in their own series of maquettes, working with this a large model. You can see their hands starting to layer things in, and working with the idea of additive growth, and the fact that you can see how one layer has been added to the next. So they're working with a set of transparent sheets, testing how things might be added. And this model just became a site of experimentation for them to keep playing with it and a way of documenting the sort of change that they anticipated, but also thinking about what sort of changes would they need to make to the framework to enable growth. As they tested the framework, they would then go back and modify it. And thinking about the idea again of how do they accommodate change, and how does that anticipated change inform their making of the original piece. So in conclusion, what I've been talking about is this idea of architecture as a representation of architecture, a certain sensibility that I have, an orientation that we invite students to engage with. We don't force them to, but invite them to engage with in terms of what we're doing and thinking about what it is that is being represented. And fundamental in that discussion is the representation of that architecture's making. How can that process of making be celebrated, but also how does that process of making anticipate future change? The idea that the building isn't fixed. As different inhabitants come into it, they start to affect their own change. And how can our original design have an open-endedness to accommodate what is very much the nature of life? Thank you very much for listening. I look forward to carrying on the discussion and hearing your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Robert Brown. Now let's open the forum for discussion.
No, yeah, I think I'll curate the. Thank you very much, Professor Robert Brown, for that alternative presentation. And when you began, in fact, I was curious how it would unfold, because I think at one level it's a very old question on what is constant, the notion of universals and the notion of here and now. And in that sense, I think the presentation has been provocative. There are quite a few questions that have been raised, but before we get to that, maybe we'll allow the group here to raise any questions or responses to the presentation. The young architects and the architects from, would someone like to respond to the presentation? Maybe I'll read from Professor Brown. Maybe I'll read from some of the questions that have been raised.
Okay, yeah, that sounds fine.
Yeah, they've just.
I'm not seeing, for some reason, I'm not seeing the questions. I don't know if.
No, it's okay. There, I'll just read them out.
That's fine.
Yeah. So one issue in such a process, which is problematic, and I think the problematic enriches the process also. I am not talking of the problematic in a negative way, but one issue is the fact that how does one program for something like this? Because generally, a building, the conventional way is to think of something static, is to think of a fixed area of and then build it. But in this case, how does one keep the dynamism of the program in the beginning of the studio?
I didn't hear the very last word. In the beginning of the studio, did you say?
Studio. How does one keep the dynamism? Because it cannot be a conventional program where you respond to like an architect and then build something. But it's something which has to remain dynamic from the beginning.
Yes.
And when it's so dynamic from the beginning, what are the references or anchors to that dynamism? Because if everything is changing, um, where does one begin? You know, if that was the question.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, what are the anchors with which you begin a studio on change?
Yeah. I like the question. I like it very much. Yeah, I didn't spend a lot of time talking about the studio practice, but I think the nature of the question really hits home on that and is, as you're suggesting, incredibly pertinent because it is a very different agenda or goal. And in some ways, it is a moving target. Typically, when one enters a studio, and certainly in my experience as a student, we would enter into the studio on day one, and the professor or tutor would say, okay, this year we are going to design a library, and our site is here in the city. Maybe there would be involvement from somebody outside, but it was a very identifiable thing. And at the end of day one, I could walk out of the studio knowing as a student, there's my site, this is what the brief is, I know all the spaces. And while that can be very valuable, that wasn't my experience of practice. And an example I always use to illustrate this, a project I worked on while I was working in London, a performing arts center is actually addition to an existing music hall, but we in effect ended up doubling the space, so quite a sizable thing. But it was part of a bigger package. And the client, local government that approached the firm I was working with saying, we want a cultural center in our city. That was the brief. They had no idea. We just want to make something happen in our city that bring people to it. Our task as an architect was to identify what was possible. Were there existing things in the city that we could build off of? That's where we found this existing music hall that kind of fallen into repair. We found an old cinema that really wasn't being used. The cinema got turned into a theater. A lot of change had to take place to turn it from a cinema into a theater. The music hall was just a space for the performance. It had none of the attributes or facilities one thinks of as a modern kind of performing arts center. All of that had to come from us in consultation with the client. So we had to become very proactive in working with the client, working with other design partners in terms of engineers and so forth, to piece it all together. We had to start asking questions in order to be able to identify what it was that we were aiming at. We couldn't just say at the beginning, we're designing one of these. We didn't know. We had to identify questions that would help reveal for us what the project might become. And that experience and any number of other projects I worked on in practice has very much informed how we approach the teaching. They're very much open-ended projects. We don't begin with here's the brief. It's going to be a cultural center, and here's the site. Rather, in the case of Macau, we went to Macau saying, here's a kind of general area we are working in. This is an area that has been marginalized. It's been left behind. A lot of development taking place elsewhere in Macau. This is the slip of land that's kind of been forgotten. The community has been forgotten. What can we envision as architects that would benefit from that area? So the students, together with staff, were speaking with local people, architects, people from the city and so forth, local community, trying to figure out what could be done to improve it. So they had to formulate questions. But in order to formulate those questions, find something that's very useful. The very first thing we do, call it Project Zero, before the students even show up at the beginning of the year, we issue them a small project where they have to make some sort of two-dimensional and or three-dimensional representation and write a short text of about 500 words articulating their own existing thoughts on a certain issue. So in the case of the project in Macau, we were talking about the nature of place and idea of shifting place that had kind of been marginalized or pushed to the side and forgotten. So we asked the students at the beginning to think about those thoughts, the idea of place and something being shifted, and write a response to that. And that written text, as well as the visual representation, is a way of pulling out of the students their thoughts about those issues. That's the constant. That becomes the kind of marker or touchstone. And interestingly, as we work on the project through the semester and the year, what comes out more and more is the ideas that they're exploring in the building are actually manifestations or reflections of that very first thing that we did. So that first project, while sometimes a bit bewildering to students when they first do it, across the rest of the year starts to make more and more sense. That's the thing that's constant. But it also, at the beginning of the year, it draws out of them, what do you think about these issues? And it's trying to help the students define their own sensibility or orientation. And with that orientation, it becomes easier to say, these are the questions I'm interested in asking. Without that, it would be too open-ended. They wouldn't know, I don't think I would have trouble knowing where to start. But by setting up that first Project Zero, it gives students an orientation and helps frame the set of questions they're interested in asking in response to what they're finding in the particular context. I hope that's all making sense, but that
Yeah, this I think it makes a sense that and as you rightly said, they were not in opposition to one another, but they were probably simultaneities. You know, both these positions are coexisting. So I think the coexistence allows the static to happen. And I'm just rephrasing what you said so that it's, if I have not got it right, you can modify it. But there is a staticness in the first few decision making, because otherwise it becomes too ambiguous. And then one measures change against what that idea was, so the initial intent becomes very important, and the response or qualification of that intent also becomes important.
Absolutely. It's interesting that the words you use, and I think maybe the phrase I would use instead of static is stable ground. it gives them kind of a firm place. Okay, I feel comfortable now. I know where I stand on these issues. And now whenever these new things are presented to me, I can always come back to that stable ground and say, well, how does that new thing relate to where I started the year at? And the word that we often use is dialogue. We're trying to generate a dialogue between their existing thinking or orientation and a whole new set of information that's being thrown at them.
Absolutely.
Or things that they think is familiar, but actually as they start to examine it, they realize maybe it's not as familiar as they thought.
No, absolutely. There's another question on, does this change have a boundary or is it unhindered change?
In terms of the students' work or in terms of the general notion I was talking about in the way of buildings and the approach to buildings?
In terms of the general notion and in terms of what can situate within those changes.
Yeah, I'm sure you know of the architect Lucien Kroll from Belgium, and also thinking about somebody like Herman Hertzberger from the Netherlands. And with each of their work, they also create something of a kind of framework or armature on which later change can be affected. But it's also very important, they say, you've got to leave hints behind. You can't leave it completely open. And there is a certain point for the architect to act. There is a certain point where the architect can bring knowledge of precedents, knowledge of particular principles, that they can set out some suggestions about how things might go forward. It is not a blank slate where people are just expected to show up and do their own thing. And in the same way, the building proposition and in the studio itself, there's got to be some framework off which to build. And the key thing is about trying to create a framework that is robust enough that can accommodate change. But still, there's got to be something in place. And I think this is where having a knowledge about precedent can be quite valuable, because it gives you something to lean back upon. And I know students can often be, and certainly in my own school, can be quite fascinated with the idea of situationists, and the idea of a kind of self-generating structure, people coming along almost in a playful way. And while that all sounds very rich, my experience in practice is there's got to be something there. And as an example of that, Ram Koolhaas doing a study of Lagos, Nigeria, and he was all excited about these spontaneous markets and saying, this is fantastic. This is exactly what should happen. And he kind of overlooked the fact that all those spontaneous markets were actually inhabiting the under areas of overhead motorways.
Absolutely.
They had provided all these motorways, and then the people, all power to them, the residents, found ways to re-inhabit it, which is great, and it says something about their ingenuity, but it also says something about the original planners who said, we're going to create this structure in this way. And I don't think you can have one without the other. If it's too open-ended, people don't know where to start. And again, this is where the architect can come in, that they can leave suggestions, they can leave hints, and they're anticipating ways that a structure might be taken over, a way that a structure might accommodate change. I don't think we can anticipate everything, but we can anticipate some things.
Yeah, I think that that kind of response to this idea that change or open-endedness doesn't mean anything goes. It doesn't mean free for all, but there's still a conscious decision making and a sensibility that goes with that nature of that change.
Absolutely. And like with the one student working in Riga who'd done the timber construction, his starting point in some respects was just about a joint. how do two pieces of timber come together? But then he blew that up, as it were, or he expanded that to say, oh, if this is the way that two pieces of wood come together, what does that mean about various parts of the building coming together? Can I employ that strategy? Does the detail give me some guidance about the building? Does that detail give me guidance about not only the building, but a collection of buildings? So in his case, it very interestingly began with that act of craft of bringing two things together. That was his kind of fixed point. It wasn't necessarily about particular aspects of spatial planning. It was rather understanding how the tectonics might inform that spatial planning. But again, he still had, there was something that, as you say, is static or fixed or stable in that context that he could build upon.
Sure. I think we'll open it to the group. If someone, I have a few more questions, but if someone would like to intervene or respond, because it's been an enlightening and provocative discussion, and really opens up a much longer discussion. So if anyone else would in the group like to respond, it would be great. Would someone else like to come in? Sinduri, the Sai Prasant, any one of y'all would like to respond? You need to unmute and you can respond.
Hello, sir. I'm Sinduri. Yeah. Coming with the things you.
Sinduri, you need to unmute.
Hello. Can you hear me
You
now,
need to
sir?
unmute.
Yes.
Yeah. With the context with what we were just talking, I would just like to ask about with the present condition and what is the kind of change that is going to impact the people, and how is it going to influence the designer as well as the user, based on condition context.
No, understand what you're saying, and I think there's a number of changes could respond to or kind of pick up on here. I think, if I may, I'll deal with one aspect, which is something I'm dealing with currently and have been dealing with in terms of work with students. Hopefully that will allow me to address your question. If it hasn't, please say so, and I'll try and respond another way. But a thing I've been working with is sea level rise and how that impacts upon cities.
Mm-hmm.
And the conventional way that cities have dealt with the sea is by creating some sort of barrier. And more contemporary research shows that environmentally that's a problem, economically it's a challenge in the context of rising sea levels, and socioculturally it's a problem, i.e. you can't keep building ever higher seawalls because that in many respects negates the very reason people want to be at the sea, i.e. you want to see it, you want to get to it, and if you're building all these seawalls, it kind of defeats the purpose. So it raises some questions about the very fundamental way we inhabit the water's edge, and in the context of sea level rise, how do we address that? Do we put up barriers? Do we move away? Or way that have been approaching it with our students and research I'm doing, can we actually find ways of actually accommodating or living with that change? And it goes back even to me setting out my introduction and talking about myself. My life's been full of change. I've had to learn to respond to that, but not to resist it, but to find ways of engaging with that. And by taking that route, a lot of opportunities have opened up that I wouldn't have anticipated. And I think certainly with our students, that's something I'm trying to encourage. In our research that I'm doing with some colleagues, looking at that possibility of how do we deal with change? Well, maybe it's about working with change rather than trying to fight it. And it's reflected in writings by the philosopher I mentioned, Bakhtin, who talks about a dialogic condition where we embrace the other. It's reflected in notions of permaculture in terms of the problem is the solution. Instead of trying to fight something, why don't you find a way of making that problem work for you? So I think for me that this is just echoing some things I was trying to get at in the talk, that instead of trying to resist change, instead of trying to think about something being timeless, recognize and embrace the idea that change is going to happen, and how do we make that work for us? I hope that's addressed your question, but if not, please say so.
Yes, sir. Like I was also trying to link about because of the COVID situation right now, and also you've mentioned the sea level rise and all this. Do you think people are gonna clutter in public spaces, or is it gonna change in that manner?
I think, again, a nice, tough question, having to get my crystal ball out and look into the future. I think what's fascinating is people's ability to adapt. And this is not the first pandemic we've ever faced. And reference keeps being made to the Spanish flu of 1918. And there are very similar preventive measures that were done. People were wearing masks. People were social distancing. I don't think it was called that at the time. But there are things that they were doing, but people started to adapt. I think we're still very early on in the process. Whether we ever go back to what we considered the normal, I don't know. I think there's a wariness that has crept into thinking. People are much more conscious about this. It's interesting, as a simple example of this, not necessarily architectural, but the way people greet each other now, they're not shaking hands. Everybody's kind of putting their elbows out, and they kind of meet elbows, or a suggestion that we should be more like the Japanese and bow. But I think there's a lot of practices that maybe we're used to doing that won't continue, but we will adapt existing practices and or adopt new ones and find ways to make things work. I don't think we're in a position where we can, at a very broad scale, start over. We have to find ways of working with what we have. Sorry, I just got a phone call that I need to stop. And I'm not doing a good job of it. Sorry. Sorry about that. But I think when we think about buildings, we think about urban space, we're going to have to be inventive in order to be able to accommodate those challenges. But we don't have the luxury of just starting over. So again, I just think we will invent new ways. And as an example, people gathering together in small groups, maybe that will be reflected a bit more in terms of how public space is furnished to allow for smaller groupings as opposed to much bigger, broader spaces, recognizing that we might be gathering in clusters as opposed to one big mass. But that's me guessing. Okay.
Yes, sir. I think it addressed most of the topics. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. But thank you for the question.
Yeah.
There's an interesting question on the chat I see. How do you convince clients to go away from traditional or conventional construction technology? Understand the question. I don't know if I'm suggesting they go away from conventional construction technology, I live in a Victorian era house in the UK that's, about 130 years old. One of the things I like about it is it's a fairly robust construction and it can accommodate change. Certainly after my architect wife and I get done with it, it will have absorbed a lot of change. It's not as if we needed the existing house to be of a different type of construction. Rather, we're responding to what it gives us and finding a way of making it work for us. So I think with clients, it's not about saying we're requiring a very different type of construction. Rather, it would be saying to the client, where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? Or where do you see yourself in 20 years' time? And how can the design of the building accommodate or anticipate that? How could we design it in a way that recognizes you live in a house in a certain way now, and in 20 years it might be different? Or as a office, you're using it in one way, but how do you anticipate your office changing in size in coming years? And can we start to anticipate that in the design? So again, I think the question's fair, but I don't see it as changing the technology. It's rather, how does the technology absorb change or provide for change? I hope that answers the question. But thank you, Nisha.
Thank you.
Hello, sir.
Hello.
Yes, please.
This is Sai Prashant. So my question is as architects, we are all thinking about creating something new or something new, advanced in a much better way to produce something creative. But do you also think that we need to look back in our ancient architecture, like for example in temple architecture there are certain technologies which we cannot even do till right now, and reinterpret the same thing in a way, because in that times they had done these technologies even in an in an eco-friendly way. Because right now, as you are talking about the sea level raise, we are introducing new technologies which are taking us to an end where we might not even foresee where we are going.
Yeah.
But initially it wasn't so, because it had a longer time. So the life of the ancient technologies were is till now used. So how do you think we interpret this thing?
Okay. Thank you for that. I think one of the challenges for architects, if not wider society, is we are fascinated by technology. Maybe I know I go into certain shops, maybe it's a mobile phone shop or an Apple store or something, and all that new stuff is so seductive. I have to pick it up and play with it. And I do think we, as architects, we appreciate the creativity, inventiveness, and these things are very valuable. But I also recognize what you're saying, that there are things that we can draw from in the past, and we can't be blinded to the possibilities of those things from the past. And sometimes it's about literally adopting that thing because it may be an appropriate solution, or sometimes it's interrogating that thing from the past that we found, recognizing that the example you gave, maybe there's not the craftsman around, but maybe there's ways that we can learn from that technology and adapt it to our present day. And the example of the student working in Riga was very much about that, saying, you know, that there were craftsmen that were around several hundred years ago that built a number of these timber buildings. And he valued those buildings, but he also recognized there weren't the craftsmen necessarily around to carry on that tradition. But yet at the same time, he was saying, you know, there is something in the timber construction. And what he was trying to do was provide an initial platform for people to become upskilled enough that they could get to that stage. That would then create a platform off which one could continue to grow. But he was recognizing in the first instance, I've just got to get the skill level up to a certain thing. And I think that's an example of saying, you know, I can take some lessons from the past. And he was reinventing those things using modern construction methods or materials, but still respecting some of the traditions of the past, or maybe not traditions, but some of the insights about how things were being put together. So I think there's a lot to be gained. I would argue that in the UK, I can't speak on behalf of India so much, but I would argue in the UK, there's a lot we could learn about some traditional construction techniques. Certainly earthen architecture, which you find a number of traditional buildings around Plymouth have been made out of that, has made a comeback, not just in the 200 or 300 year old buildings, but greater experimentation. I have some colleagues in the university looking at earthen architecture and trying to think about how do we bring it forward into the 21st century. So I think one of the things that's happened in the context of concerns about the environment, concerns about resources, is a looking back to the past and saying, are there some lessons we can learn from this? And I think that idea of learning lessons is crucial. It's not necessarily just taking something from the past and bringing it forward, but actually examining it and understanding, are there aspects of that tradition that we can carry on? And I think that what I'm saying is reflected in certainly a Western origin of the use of the word tradition, which was meant to communicate the idea of carrying something forward. It was evolving. Tradition was not fixed, it was not static. It was understood that it could evolve in relation to new circumstances, new places, and a new time. So I think our engagement with the past needs to remember that very important aspect of tradition, or looking to the past, that it has embedded in it the idea that it can and maybe should evolve.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Sai.
We could take one more question and then we could. Is there anyone else would like to respond? Professor Brown, I would say this was a very enriching experience, enriching talk, the wide range of issues that have opened up. I do look forward to a kind of a collaborative, if it's possible, through the next few months, a collaborative studio or some kind of an interaction, because many of these themes are notions and issues that we are grappling with over some period of time. I wouldn't say it's linked to the lockdown or it's linked to the present. It's been something, as you rightly mentioned, Hermann Hertzberger, and this whole idea of module growth, change, has been a fascinating search. And I think we've reached a moment in society and in history where the pace of that changes, or the rapidity of the changes, is really in question today. And I think the questions and the studio you've done reveal that kind of potential and possibilities.
Hmm.
And so I really look forward. I mean, it's also looking at history, it's looking at the idea of memory, it's looking at the idea of meaning. While we didn't discuss it, but I think it it has the notions of looking at meaning, social justice, memory, amnesia, and how this whole grows in conjunction with nature. Nature itself is under organic change, so I think it has opened up a very important issue, not just of change, but I see it more, and which you mentioned it in the beginning, of an ecological response. Having come to the threshold of climate change ourselves, I think this has the potential of dealing with the ecology of inhabiting the earth. And I
Hmm.
think our fetish as architects to create this large monument, to create this kind of fixity, may have landed us in this. That's a speculation. I don't have evidence to it. But I would say maybe that has landed us in this kind of a situation, and where we need to rethink of a very lighter way of being rather than the fixity of with what architecture generally associated.
Yeah.
And would you like to round up before I invite Dr. Jyoti Lakshmi then to
Yep.
sum up the presentation?
Okay. Well, yes, I'll round up. Firstly, to say thank you again for the opportunity to speak and for people coming along today to listen and for the questions offered. But also to say thank you again for the discussion on Monday. And I think the time between Monday and today is reflecting something of what we've both just been talking about.
Sure.
That is, the talk that I was going to give Monday morning before speaking to you is different from the talk I just gave. And I think that reflects the idea that you said some things on Monday morning that made me think. And I thought, all right, I need to go away. And that's a change. I had to accommodate some unknown thing that I hadn't anticipated. I had to be flexible in my thinking in order to respond to that. And that only would have come about through talking with you. I wouldn't have done that on my own. So that engagement with another, as you're suggesting, in terms of a way of going forward, is really quite crucial. It pushes us, it challenges us in the best possible ways. And as I was suggesting at the very beginning of the talk, and hopefully throughout the talk, life has changed. So many things are changing. And as you correctly said, the pandemic is just one example of that. It's not the pandemic's changing things. It's, that's the big thing. History's full of a number of changes, and climate change, pandemic, economics, and so forth. It's just an incredibly changing world we live in. And I would echo what you're saying. The pace of change is so much quicker. And I would argue as architects, we need to be able to respond to that change. As educators, we need to support students to be able to respond to that change. So I would say if there's anything I would suggest or offer out of this talk, it's about embracing change, because that's what's on offer. We have to.
Thank you, Professor.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
I think there's a resonance that we can build up between Plymouth and Saveetha now. In two different cultural contexts, I think it may just lend itself to something more unpredictable and very interesting, is what I see from what you presented. I invite Dr. Jyoti Lakshmi to kind of sum up the session, a wonderful session, and I invite Dr. Jyoti Lakshmi to now sum it up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, sir. Professor Robert. It was a wonderful presentation, and I think all of us really enjoyed the presentation. The university in which you are working itself is like the humanity business. That itself is, I felt it is a very good interest group of mix of different diversified fields coming together. Is except teacher and everybody can work. And the key word which I would like to highlight from your presentation today is the adaptability and the change. So as I think you are a true person, because from Monday discussion what you had with our dean, you could change the presentation according to the context in which we are looking for. I think that itself is a big change. Yeah, such an adaptable and flexible person. So all of us have to be very adaptable, flexible, as well as need to change to the situation. And our design solutions also has to be in relation with that. And your design solutions, especially the school design approach, where students have been involved and using the recycled materials for innovative ideas, and using that particular space design were really wonderful. And I found that it was a really interesting and very innovative approach of design. So I thank a lot from Saveetha College of Architecture and Design, from the entire team of faculty, students, as well as our Deepak coordinated. So that, and as our dean suggested, we would like to be more interactions with you, with our studios and other exchange programs, where students would like to come and do a studio with you, and your students also can be involved with studio works, as well as which we regularly conduct. Welcome again. Thanks a lot for accepting our invitation and giving a wonderful presentation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you again. And I look forward to future interactions. Very much so.
Thank you, Dr. Brown.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining.
Deepak sir.
Yeah,
Thank you,
thank you,
Dean
ma'am.
sir. Thank you.